Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and you're listening to The Business of Content, a podcast about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. Today, we're talking about why Fortune 100 companies like Samsung are launching their own branded podcasts. It's impossible to know which company launched the first branded podcasts, but one of the earliest well-known examples was GE's The Message. Produced in collaboration with Panoply, The Message was a science fiction documentary that generated millions of downloads and a rabid fan base. Ever since GE's runaway success with the medium, other major brands have waded into the podcast waters, with large companies like Walmart and Goldman Sachs launching their own shows in recent years. But what makes a branded podcast good? How do you avoid making it sound like just another ad? And how does a successful podcast help a company's bottom line? To answer these questions, I interviewed Rachael King, founder of the podcast consulting company Pod People. She recently helped produce podcasts for companies like Samsung and Medium, and we talked about the rise in demand for the services she offers and how one develops the skill set needed to become a podcast consultant. Let's jump right into it. Hey, Rachael, thanks for joining us.
Hello, Simon. Thank you so much for having me.
So you have a lot of competition with other Rachael Kings who are media figures. I was Googling your name and I came across a former Wall Street Journal reporter who now works at YouTube, and another Rachael King who's a New Zealand novelist. But I think out of all of them, you're the one most likely to become a media mogul.
Oh, well, we'll see about that. I don't know. I used to be in PR, so I would pitch the Rachael Kings sometimes. And we, at one point, were all adding each other on Twitter and joking about how we needed to start a club for the Rachael Kings.
It'd be awesome if you guys all started a company together.
Right. What would we call it, though?
Yeah. The Three Kings.
Yeah, exactly.
So you now run a podcast consulting company. And when I looked at your LinkedIn profile, I was expecting to find a background in public radio, but you don't have a broadcast background. How did you get started with podcasts?
Yeah, so I have been a huge fan of storytelling for many years. That's my background, is in communications and helping companies figure out how to tell their story in an interesting way that people are actually going to care about. And I've been obsessed with podcasts and audio for a really long time. And last year, I decided to sort of make the leap from pitching company stories to reporters to helping companies tell their story as in the form of audio storytelling, in the form of podcasts. Similar to when I started out in social media marketing back when we both knew each other in DC some 10 years ago. It started out where people were using social media and then very quickly became a form of content marketing for brands. I see that same thing happening with podcasts, and I wanted to sort of jump in and be at the forefront of it. And conversely, I feel like right now, a lot of companies do want to get into this game and they just don't know how to go about it. So I decided to create a community of, we have a couple hundred talented freelance audio creators. They're sound engineers and producers and hosts and sound designers, everyone who works to make a beautiful, audio production. And a company can come to us and say, we want to make a podcast. We either have an idea or we don't have an idea. We have no idea what it should cost. I'll help them figure out all that high level stuff and then put together the perfect team from the Pod People community who is, has the right background and the right skills to make that perfect show.
Mm-hmm. So you're almost kind of like a recruiter, project manager than like a audio producer yourself.
Yeah, well, I do executive produce the projects that Pod People makes. We've done one for Medium that launched a few weeks ago, and Samsung, which is, I think, why we got connected. But yeah, it's like a hybrid production company and this sort of talent agency for all these freelance folks, sort of like a freelancers union that finds them work so that the creatives can focus on what they're good at, which is making the thing.
So, but if you didn't come from the broadcast, the reason why a lot of like podcast consultants and audio producers, they come from public radio is because that's where you learn that kind of nitty gritty, like, cutting tape and sound design and all that kind of stuff. How did you kind of cut your teeth with that?
Sure. So I've had my own sort of hobby podcast for the last 3, maybe 4 years, called the She Pod. And it's nothing I would send to a client to be like, look what I can do. It's very bare bones, but it's a lot of fun. And so I do the editing on that. And that is sort of how I got into the idea, the creation process and the production process. And then as I built this community of all of these independent freelancers, I lean on them really heavily for their expertise, of course, and their skills. But I also have a deputy in each of our major cities, New York, LA, and San Francisco, and hopefully DC soon as well, where they are sort of my go-to person to put together proposals and estimates and all of that good stuff for clients.
Yeah, because like I interviewed someone else who runs another podcast consulting company a few months ago, and but they're mainly just kind of the talky type podcasts that they produce for like associations and stuff like that. Having listened to some of the podcasts your company's produced, especially the one from Medium, you guys are doing like a higher level of production, and I think there's like a definitely a difference between the people who can offer up the we'll help you create a Q&A type podcast versus those who can create something that's more analogous for This American Life. And I know that like some brands, when they approach these podcast consultants, that they always want to start out with I want to do This American Life, and then they have to be talked down once they learn what the actual prices are to produce something of that high level.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. The nice thing is the producers and other audio professionals who are in the Pod People community. I mean, a lot of them do work on Radiolab and This American Life and Freakonomics and Gimlet shows. A lot of them are at that level of expertise, which is nice. But because I don't have the overhead of being a brick and mortar, needing studios, we sort of are on that more flexible schedule where you can scale up teams as we need them. We can rent studio space as we need. We have partners who we work with for studio space, so we're able to sort of keep costs in that middle tier where you can still make something really special, but it's not going to cost as much as it might from the larger names that you've heard. And I personally specialize in branded content because that's my background, is again helping companies tell their story in an interesting way. But we also have a lot of projects who come into Pod People and the budget is smaller than something we would take on ourselves, in which case I will refer it out to one of our producers or two, if depending on the budget, and just take a finder's fee for putting them in touch with the perfect person, sort of playing matchmaker, because we do have this really large community of folks all over the country.
And what's that market look like, these folks who are in your spreadsheets to reach out to? Like, are these people working traditional broadcasts and this is their side hustle? Like, because we're seeing this explosion in podcasts right now, and these companies are finally getting venture capital money and they're aggressively hiring, but like obviously public radio isn't creating enough people, like new people with these skill sets. So they're some of them are desperate. Are these freelancers you're working with? Like, what's the market like right now? Is it a buyer's market, a seller's market for these type of people who have these skill sets? What's that like right now?
Yeah, I think right now it would be it's a great market for an independent producer. But the problem is getting connected to the projects. And so that's the problem that I'm trying to solve. I would say about 2/3 of the people in the community are fully independent. And so they might have regular ongoing projects, but they're a contractor on all of them. Whereas maybe 1/3 has a day job, if you will, and then we'll do projects on the side. And I'm keeping track of that because it's constantly changing. So every month I'll check in with the folks and say, okay, what's your bandwidth look like for July? What's it look like for August? So that I know at the ready who's going to be available when a project comes in, and who's currently looking for work versus who's, in South Africa working on a project for the next couple months. But I think there's definitely more than enough work, and it's growing exponentially. And we're getting to the point where companies are ready to, pay substantial real money for, it's a ton of work. And so they're starting to realize that. And so I think just the problem right now is the connection between the producers and the projects. And so that's what I'm trying to solve.
And what's the demand on the brand side? Like, are companies just beating down your door right now? Like right around this time of like Serial, I talked to an agency. It was the first agency I'd ever come across that specialized in created branded podcasts, and they were a little bit too ahead of their time, and they actually ended up shutting down. But I get the sense that now, like a few years after Serial, it's like we're hitting like peak demand or very strong demand, where a lot of brands are looking to launch their own podcasts.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I think right after Serial, it was still a little too new, at least for brands. I think that what it did, which is super cool, is inspired a lot of the existing private networks to get more experimental with their original content or investigative content. And, obviously we've seen an explosion in the number of shows and the quality of shows, which is awesome. But yeah, I think like we launched in January 2018, and I think that was the best possible. I mean, we'll see, hindsight 2020, but I think that was the best possible time to launch and the way to position ourselves.
I mean,
There's
just based on
definitely
the recent research, I think the industry only produced $300 million, which is just like a tiny pin drop compared to like radio. So, I mean, everybody is assuming we're at the very beginning of this hockey
we
stick
are,
growth within the
but if you
industry.
look at the growth, right? If you look at the growth year over year of advertising spend, and not only the number of dollars, but the stickiness, it's so sticky. Like podcast listeners are the best possible audience and customers that you could have because they're so loyal and they really listen and they actually will go to, Casper.com and type in that promo code if they're in the market for a mattress. Like it really does work for a lot of different types of advertising business models, which is so cool. But yes, we're definitely just at the beginning of it. A lot of it is super manual. A lot of it is like borderline analog. And so I'm looking forward, since my background is in startups and technology, I'm also very much looking forward to all these new companies coming in and trying to solve the problems of discovery and inventing new ways that advertising can work. I think that's going to be really exciting over the next couple of years.
And there are all these agencies that are launching now. So there's like Pineapple Street Media,
Yeah.
there's Gimlet, there's Pacific Content. Each has a little bit slightly different. So like Pacific Content is 100%. Sorry for name dropping some of your competitors, but they're
That's
like
okay. I
they're
love them. Yeah.
they're like 100% consultancy, and then you have Gimlet, which is both a media company that's producing their own high end podcasts that are just under their own brands, and then they have like a creative studio agency, and then you have like Pineapple, which is kind of like in between the two, where they are producing some at cost versus others that are more
Right.
profitable. Where do you see your mix wanting to be? Like, do you have any ambitions to build a podcast network, or is this purely just a consultancy? And like, what's the scalability of that?
Yeah, for me, well, first of all, I'd like to say that because it is such early days, the nice thing is I guess they're competitors in a way. I view us, I'm sort of like a middle cost tier. I'm not quite in the same cost tier as they would be because I don't have studio space and don't have all that overhead and bandwidth, or overhead rather. So I think it is different in that way. But the other thing is, like, I'm very friendly with people at most of those networks. I have, folks who we talk about all of this stuff with because it is such early days. It's really collaborative instead of competitive, which is one thing that I absolutely love about this industry. But I do. So remind me what I want to make sure I answer your actual question, your original.
Well, just like what your ambitions are, whether it's just to be a
Oh,
pure,
yes.
or do you want something more scalable where you start building out your own network?
Yeah, so I think there are enough networks, and I think that there are enough networks who focus on, different niches and different types of shows. What I'd really love to do is to be the source of work that is finding that focus on that matchmaking part of it, where I'm putting the right person in the right gig and getting them work constantly so they don't have to spend time, out hunting for clients and negotiating and drumming up business, sort of all those things that I am really good at. So, my dream is that is the part of the business that takes off more, because that is a way that I can be really supportive to this ecosystem. And like, even if Gimlet needs someone, they can come to us and we can find the right, producer, whoever it is that they need for a show specifically. And that way we're all sort of working together. Us taking on a few branded projects, like that's also not scalable. We can only do so many. And will I love it? And it's a lot of fun. And like working on something like, Medium is absolutely a passion project and, generates income. I think the matchmaking piece of the business is much more interesting and more needed because it doesn't exist yet.
So you're in LA. There's this new trend that's happening where Hollywood is getting involved in podcasts, launching either their own spin-off podcasts like the Wolverine podcast that Marvel did, or what we're seeing even more of is companion podcasts. Netflix just launched one to go along with their nonfiction or their documentary shows. ESPN launched a 30 for 30 podcast. This goes all the way to Breaking Bad when I forget, I'm blanking on who created Breaking Bad, but he had his own companion podcast. Are you kind of involved in any Hollywood, any of these Hollywood discussions about how do we kind of create this like parallel universe of podcasts to go along with television entertainment?
Yeah, we have been talking to Fox about helping them to create a scripted show that would be a companion to one of their movie franchises. And unfortunately, I can't say more than that, but it would be super cool. And there's a lot of that happening here, which is really interesting. And a lot of the scripted stuff, I think scripted has a long way to go. There's definitely been some really cool, things put out there, but not a ton of it. And so I'd love to see more of that. And I think LA is probably the town to do it. And I'd love to get involved in it. And so a lot of my producers have said that they'd really love to get involved with a scripted project because it's just, creativity knows no limits with something like that.
What's the epicenter of the podcast world? Is it New York? Obviously that's for a lot of the media. That's what it is.
Yeah, I think I would say that New York is the biggest. It certainly is for radio. New York is the epicenter of radio world. And so a lot of the audio is there, but like Pacific Content is in Vancouver and there's a ton, Wondery's here, Earwolf is here, now part of Midroll, but Earwolf was started here. And there's a ton of really great networks here in Los Angeles as well. And so I'm sort of hoping to help grow the West Coast. But I don't think it's far behind. I don't think the difference in podcasts specifically, in radio, there is a large gap, I think. But in podcasts specifically, I don't think there's such a huge lead in New York. I think that's changing quickly as the West Coast gets much more involved.
Tell me how a typical client engagement goes, like, from them approaching you, what kind of expectations do clients come with, and what's kind of your approach to help them develop a show?
Yeah. The nice thing is they come with almost zero expectations because they've never done this before, for the most part. All the clients who I've spoken with have, I think 90% of them have no idea where to even begin with a podcast, which is great because I can, make sure that they're getting the right information versus them coming with preconceived notions of, oh, we're going to pay somebody, $200 an episode and you can do that. You sure can, but it's not going to be anything special. So when they come to me, I've had this conversation a zillion times. I'm ready and armed to figure out, okay, what kind of show do you want to make? And here's the kind of team that you would need for that and the sort of budget if you want to do it right. Here are ways that you can cut costs. Here are ways that you can make the show better and what that would cost, and sort of give them all the options. And with most clients, we'll get to the point where, I'm drawing up a proposal for the show and I'll give them a few different versions of what it could look like and the budget that corresponds to that. And they can choose which one they want to do. And I think the nice thing about our model is there's a lot of companies who aren't ready to invest, the hundreds of thousands of dollars that it can take to do a really, really high level production. And so we can sort of figure out a middle of the road where it's like, okay, you've got tens of thousands of dollars as opposed to hundreds. Here's what we can do with that. It can still be something really special here because, we've got the perfect team who's got the right expertise and the flexibility of, not having overhead again. And so here's what that can look like, but giving them options and having that, the different flexibility and different, like, here's what we could do with a team of 3 people versus 5 people versus 7 people. Here's what it would cost if we have sound design. Here's what it would cost if we have, field recordings. all those different things can add to it. And so there's a big education piece, but I really enjoy it.
And like, how much of the engagement is in person? Like having, I mean, you have to find like local people to come to them versus like what we're doing now, like recording remotely? What's that dynamic like?
It's really different for each project. So like with medium playback, the authors and the hosts are all over. One of our hosts is in Los Angeles and one is in New York, and they alternate episodes. And then the authors can be anywhere. We've had Seattle, we've had San Francisco, we've had New York, we've had somewhere in, I think it was North Dakota. So that is a different process where every single episode we're sort of figuring out, okay, which areas do we need studio in, and how do we coordinate all of that. Meanwhile, the client themselves is located in San Francisco, so my producer is there, but I'll fly up once a month for in-person meetings, and the rest we're doing via Slack and phone calls. Whereas Samsung, we set up a recording studio in their office in Mountain View where they can do the interviews, and the guests will usually be there. Sometimes it is remote, and then we're figuring that out. But in general, most of like the voiceovers and the interviews are being done in their office. So we, have our producer goes into the office and will oversee the recordings and be directing everything there. So it's really different based on the project and the format of the show, and whether there's remote locations or if we need studios. Like all of that can change depending on the details of the show.
How do you find hosts for the clients? Like, are you on the hunt for someone within their organization who's charismatic, or are you looking to find outside celebrities / journalists who might have broadcast experience and pairing them? What's that like in terms of finding the right host?
Again, that really depends on the show. So with Samsung, obviously it's a conversation about the future of technology, and each episode explores a different sector of that, whether it's VR or AI or smart cities or blockchain. And so their head of content, Ryan Lawler, who is also a veteran tech journalist,
he's like a tech blogger from like Gizmodo or somewhere like that, right?
TechCrunch too for years. So yeah. I mean, he's really got that subject matter expertise, and he is, has been interviewing people for years. So, he's fantastic. It is interesting because he hasn't done it on mic before, and he's really good at it, but it's just a different experience. So that's been kind of a fun thing to work on with him. And he's a delight, and it's been a really fun project. But then Medium is a different kind of thing where we're having these, renowned authors like Roxane Gay and Baratunde Thurston are reading their pieces that they've written for Medium. And so for that, it makes more sense to have a really experienced host like Manoush Zomorodi and Kara Brown are our two hosts, and they alternate episodes. And each one of them, is well known within the podcast world, and they're both journalists in their own right. And so we're choosing each episode who should be the host based on who has more of a background. Like obviously Manoush, her entire show, Note to Self, is about the connection between technology and humanity and how that affects us. And so for her, pairing her with Baratunde Thurston's story about digital detox and protecting all your data online, couldn't have been a better fit. Whereas Kara Brown, we had with Roxane Gay, because they have a lot. Well, Kara is a huge fan of Roxane's, as we all should be. And so is really familiar with her writing. And that made a lot of sense because there were discussions of, women's issues and, being a woman in the world and what does that mean? So we made very conscious decisions of who the host should be for that show based on who's going to have these really emotional and thoughtful conversations.
Mm-hmm. So podcast listenership is known for being hard to grow quickly. It's just not optimized for virality. Do you have to like reorient your clients towards kind of long-term thinking? Like, one of the most steadfast or true things that they say about growing a podcast audience is you just have to keep on producing episode after episode and just be fine with that like slow linear growth. You come from the content marketing world where you can, create a video, and if it's really creative, it could go viral, or you could put a heavy ad spin behind it, but there's not that kind of that kind of virality with podcasts. Like, how do you set expectations around that for clients?
Yeah, I think all of that is true, especially if you don't have, a name brand or, a host who's well known within the podcast world. I think that's all definitely true. I have certainly do manage those expectations, but there are a lot of things that you can do to really help it move along. Obviously, publishing great episodes consistently is the first and most important thing you can do. But I also have within the community, I have 3 or 4 people who specialize in podcast marketing. And so, if a client comes on board and wants to employ their services, whether it's to just come up with a strategy and they can execute it themselves or to actually execute it for them, we can also help out with that. And we've made a really, really long list of like 100 different things you can do to help promote your show in the beginning and throughout. And so going through all of those all of those things, they really do help a lot. But as you said, it is a slower grind. But also the people that you get, like when you get a podcast listener, they're so loyal, they're so dedicated, and they're letting you talk into their ear for, 30 minutes, as opposed to seeing a tweet or an Instagram that's a couple seconds and then you disappear from their thought. Whereas if I listen to an entire interview with someone from a company that I was maybe interested in, I'm definitely going to think more highly of them. It's a different thing because you're listening to them directly. And so you kind of really believe what they're saying, as opposed to just reading an article that was an interview with someone. And you're like, okay, well, I don't know if they really said it that way, or sometimes you can't get the sense of whether they're being authentic or not, which you absolutely can with a podcast. It's so intimate. It feels like you're just sitting down at coffee with someone.
Well, one of the most effective ways that I've, based on my studying of it, of growing listenership is to get mentioned on other podcasts. And I'm seeing a lot of podcasts buying ads on other podcasts, but B, doing these kind of like swap recommendation things. Like do you have to try to get your clients to set aside a budget, not just for the production of the podcast, but advertising or doing this kind of marketing on other podcasts?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I certainly try to, because as you said, it's the number one most effective thing that you can do, short of, being featured in the iTunes store, which you can't buy. Mm-hmm. So, in terms of things that you have control over, it is absolutely the most effective. And I do highly recommend not only that they but also set aside, money to purchase sponsored ads and stuff like that, but also just time, because it takes a lot of time to negotiate cross promotions. If they don't have a budget, then, you either can spend time or you can spend money. And if you don't have money, then you can dedicate time to trying to find similar podcasts and offering to promote each other, whether that's on the podcast itself or in an email swap or lots of different avenues. But yeah, I absolutely encourage people to focus on that as one of their most important strategies when they're launching and trying to grow.
So you mentioned the Samsung and the Medium podcast. I listened to both. I really enjoyed the Medium podcast. It reminds me of the Modern Love podcast, which is a huge compliment, because that's another great podcast. So tell me a little bit about that. Ironically, this is the second Medium podcast that I've been reporting on. I just wrote an article about Coin Talk, which is the cryptocurrency podcast that Medium is funding. So it seems like for some reason, or that Medium is investing in podcasting, especially as they try to grow their kind of paid membership. What were your kind of discussions with them, and like what are the goals of the podcast?
Yeah. So it's interesting because Ev Williams, the founder, he actually, before Medium, he started an audio related company. I can't remember exactly what it did. Yeah, but he's been interested in audio for a long time, obviously. And so when I met with the Medium guys, who are probably my favorite people of all time, they're so wonderful. And working with them has been so much fun. So when I first met with them and they were telling me, what they were thinking, the reason that they had this idea was because they had created in the Medium app, there's a section that's got a little headphone on it, and you click that, and it takes you to author voices, which is where they have people reading their pieces out loud. And it doesn't have production.
Yeah.
There's no music, there's no sound design. It's just very simple. Like, I am Rachael King, and this is my story for Medium, and then they read it. And that's it. But they were doing
I actually had something produced. I did a freelance piece for them last year, and they created an audio version of it. And I think they had like a professional audio narrator who read my piece.
Yeah, so they have other categories as well. But the author voices one, where people were reading their own pieces, was the one that they were seeing sort of crazy engagement with. And so that's why they decided to do this kind of show format, where it's the author reading their piece. And then we're putting, production behind it, music, and making it come alive with sound design, and then having this Q&A with our really thoughtful host, who is sort of getting the story behind the story. So they had seen the data of the author voices doing so well in the app, and that's why they decided to invest more heavily in it. And I expect that we'll see more from them in terms of other shows as well.
And how many episodes are you producing on what kind of basis?
The first season will be 10 episodes, and then we'll go from there.
Interesting. All right. Well, those were all the questions I had for you. Where can people find you online?
You can find us at podpeople.com or at PODPPL on Instagram, where we share our favorite shows that we're listening to, as well as our own. And I am Rachael, Rachael, at podpeople.com if anyone wants to get in touch.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. This is a lot of fun.
Thank you so much. I look forward to listening to it and checking out all the other episodes.
Okay, that's all we have for you today. Be sure to subscribe to the Business of Content on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. See you next week.